All right, we're at 5 after. I'll admit more people as soon as we do introductions and a proper welcome. But let me begin by saying Bruchi Hamad Ba'im. It's great to see all of you. I want to give a hearty Todah Rabbah, a big thank you to all of Temple Added Israel's co-sponsors, to our friends at Ohave Zion Synagogue, the Lexington Havurah, Hadassah, Jewish Federation of the Bluegrass, and Hillel at UK.
Wow.
A couple of Zoom ground rules. We've all been doing this for about 8 or 9 months by now, but here it goes nonetheless. Once we introduce our speaker and begin, please put yourself in mute mode. Feel free to paste a question or a comment in the chat. I will pick up the questions in the chat as a moderator when we get to question and answer time, and we'll invite you when the program is winding down and Q&A is over to unmute. Go ahead and put yourselves in gallery view if you've been in speaker view during the talk, and we can say hello to each other once again. And with that, let me begin by formally thanking tonight's speaker, Gabriel Popkin, for agreeing to do this talk. Tu B'Shvat, the 15th day of the month of Shvat, is sort of like a Jewish Arbor Day, or the New Year of the Trees. It's the time, if you've been to Israel, where the shkeidia, the almond tree, starts to show its little white bud or blossom. I forget what the proper term is. Someone can set me straight in the chat, whether it's a bud or a blossom. It's got a beautiful smell and it's a gorgeous flower. And while it may seem like the beginning of spring is a ways off here, it's the first sign that spring is eventually coming in Israel. And at this time of renewed hope and with new leadership and a renewed emphasis on the environment and a new opportunity to be more engaged stewards of our planet, it's particularly gratifying to welcome back to Lexington, albeit via Zoom, Gabriel Popkin, who is the son of Beata and Jeremy Popkin. He is a science writer, writing about environmental issues. He lives in Maryland. He writes often about trees and broader environment for general interest publications, such as the New York Times and the Washington Post, and science-oriented publications like Nature and Science. He also leads tree walks in the Washington, D.C. area, and he grew up right here in Lexington in the Bluegrass. Please join me in a round of applause before going muted for tonight's speaker, Gabriel Popkin.
Well, thank you very much for that gracious introduction, David. I always caution people, don't applaud it until you hear the talk. See if you actually want to applaud it. I just want to say this is a delightful mix of the Central Kentucky Jewish community and tree enthusiasts of the DC area, which I don't think has ever been a group that has never all convened it before. So I guess we can thank Zoom for that. I also want to point out that even though it's starting to snow here, I've got my tree themed shirt on to remind us that there will be warmer days and leafier days ahead. It's true, I did grow up in Lexington, Kentucky, and I'm a lapsed Temple Added Israel Sunday school student. So it's extra gracious for you all to invite me back for this talk.
Our religious school directors all approve.
I imagine the ones who were there at the time have moved on. Anyway, I did grow up in Lexington, and the my earliest memories of trees are what seemed like incredibly tall pin oak trees and holly trees and dogwood trees in the yard of our house where we lived when I was a kid. But to be honest, I didn't pay very much attention to trees that whole time, or even till years later when I started a graduate program at the University of Wisconsin. And I took an ecology course, and in that course, we had to learn 14 trees. So I learned those trees, and that helped me realize that I could learn to identify trees, that it wasn't that hard, and that actually once I knew 14 trees, I knew a pretty good percentage of the trees that I saw around me in Madison, Wisconsin. It's up north, so there aren't that many different kinds of trees that can survive in that climate. And another thing happened to me that year. I traveled to Georgia for the wedding of two friends, and we went on a hike and up a sort of a stream valley to a waterfall, and there were all these huge dead trees around me. And I knew enough to know that they were hemlock trees and that they were being killed by a tiny insect. And what struck me is that nobody else seemed to be aware of this, that everybody else was just hiking and playing in the stream and laughing. And I was like thinking to myself, don't you realize we're surrounded by dead trees and there's like a huge environmental disaster going on right here, and nobody's noticing. So that kind of opened my eyes to the fact that there are a lot of stories out there to be told about trees, and that maybe this is something that I could do. I happened to be starting my career as a science writer at that time, and I needed something to write about, and seemed like trees was as good a thing as any. Obviously, I was interested in it. So that kind of got me going. Some of my earliest stories were about hemlocks, and I've kind of kept going ever since. As David mentioned, I do now live in the DC area, and it's not what you see on the news, but we do have a lot of great trees here in DC as well. So I was invited to give this talk, and David made it very clear that there was no expectation for any theological or religious content, which is good because I'm absolutely not an expert on those topics. But I did want to try to sort of frame this talk with a few passages about trees that appear in the Torah, the Hebrew Bible, or other sources. And then I'll move into the area that I'm a little bit more familiar with, which is science and the environment. And what I want to sort of think about is kind of play on this idea from one of the passages I'll share. Are the trees of the field human? In other words, in what ways are humans like trees, and in what ways are we very different from trees? And what does this mean for the relationship between us and between trees? And what can we learn from this? And how can we, since religion isn't just about learning, but it's also about solving problems, and I think one could say the same for science. How can we actually kind of use these ideas and this knowledge to maybe solve some of our problems, some of our environmental problems, and maybe even help us in our spiritual growth? I mean, that we'll see. This whole talk is a bit of an experiment. I've never given it before, so I hope it is interesting and engaging, and I certainly welcome your feedback. And I will now share my screen, hopefully successfully. Are we shared? Is that good? Okay. So this is a well-known passage, and it's where the title of my talk comes from. I'll just read it. When in your war against a city, you have to besiege it. Here we go. A long time in order to capture it, you must not destroy its trees, wielding the axe against them. You may eat of them, but you must not cut them down. Are trees of the field human to withdraw before you into the besieged city? Only trees that you know do not yield food may be destroyed. You may cut them down for constructing siege works against the city that is waging war on you. until it has been reduced. And this is from Deuteronomy, which a lot of people I'm sure know is the 5th book of the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. So there's a lot going on here. I think one thing that strikes me is that it's a little bit archaic. Most of us are not involved in besieging cities or defending them. I now realize as I say that if I had said that a few weeks ago, it would have sounded different. But there's also a lot going on that I think is kind of relevant or resonant to us. One thing that strikes me is that this passage doesn't really say directly whether trees are like humans, but it poses a question, but it sort of poses it in a leading way that leads us to recognize the difference between us and trees. And that difference is that trees are kind of stuck in place, they can't move, and in the context of a human conflict, trees are innocent bystanders in a way. They're not part of the conflict, and therefore it is not okay to treat them as combatants, but rather they need to be respected, left alone. Another thing I note is that it alludes to 2 different sorts of uses of trees, or 2 different aspects of the relationship between humans and trees. One is that trees provide us food, and the other is that they provide us material. And then it makes a distinction between those food-bearing trees and non-food-bearing trees, and sort of elevates one above the other. Now, I think that distinction is problematic, and I'm going to come back to that later in the talk, but I just wanted to note that right now. I think that's all I wanted to say about that. The next passage, Rabbi David forwarded me an email just this afternoon where I learned of this passage that shows you how much I have to learn about Scripture. But I thought it was very apropos, and it says, so a righteous person, that's not the literal word, but I'm summing up the previous 2 verses, is like a tree planted beside streams of water, which yields its fruit in season, whose foliage never fades, and whatever it produces thrives. So I wanted to juxtapose this with the previous verse, because in this case, we're being asked to consider a way in which people may be like trees. And I think what I note here is it's not instructing us to be like a tree. It's telling us that if we are righteous, we will become like a tree. And specifically, we will share these positive attributes of a tree. In other words, that it produces fruit and will be fruitful. Foliage never fades. Certainly not true of the trees around here, but it's a nice idea. And this idea of thriving. So already we have one sort of passage that suggests that trees are like people, or people are like trees, and another that suggests that they're different. So that sort of frames the talk to some extent. And then moving on, now we're going back to the very beginning, to Genesis, where we encounter the first tree that appears in the Bible. This is the only Hebrew I attempt. It's Chaim, or the tree of life. So Genesis says that the first living things to appear in the Garden of Eden were seed-bearing plants and fruit trees of every kind. And to me, this suggests that the authors of the Bible recognized sort of the foundational nature of trees, that it's hard to have other life if you don't have trees. And we might, in modern terms, say that the trees are either foundation species in an ecosystem, or that they're at the foundation of a food web or a food chain. Now, I think, this isn't entirely consistent with our modern understanding, our modern scientific view of evolution. Life actually evolved long before trees appeared on the scene. That was around 300 to 400 million years ago. But I think we can certainly recognize that the planet was a radically different place before there were trees, probably a place we would find very inhospitable. And the appearance of trees and the evolution of the modern trees that we know today, and forests and the ecosystems were, this has all made the planet a much friendlier, nicer place like that we would actually want to live in, similar to what we imagine the Garden of Eden to be like. So I also place, so that left photo or that image on the left is from Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel. On the right, we have the Torah itself. And I recently learned, thanks to my rabbi friend, Laura Bellows, who may or may not be in the audience tonight, that the Torah itself is referred to as Etz Chaim, the tree of life. And this is interesting because the Torah it appears sort of superficially to be a static text that has been written. It doesn't change. And so what does it mean to think of it as a tree, which is a growing, living, breathing thing? Well, we can, Laura suggested to me that the Torah is actually an evolving thing in itself, because we're always studying, we're learning, we're discussing it, we're applying its lessons in different directions. So in this way, we can see that the metaphor of a tree may actually be appropriate and suggest kind of a broader understanding of what this text may be able to provide us. And I'm sure there's others in the audience who could say many more learned things about that. So I will move on to the last couple passages. These aren't from the Bible at all, but from later writings and teachings. But there's a very well-known line that says, from a rabbi, that says, if you should be holding a sapling in your hand when they tell you the Messiah has arrived, first plant the sapling and then go out and greet the Messiah. So this is kind of surprising. We would think, maybe naively, that once the Messiah arrives, that's it. We don't need to worry about anything else. But actually, this seems to be telling us that no, we should not focus only on spiritual things, but the material world matters as well. And in particular, that we have a responsibility to care for the material world. And that is responsibility kind of equal to spiritual responsibilities. And then the second passage, a righteous man encountered a man planting a tree, and he said, how long will it take to bear fruit? About 70 years. So you think you will live long enough to taste its fruits? The man explained, I have found ready grown carob trees in the world, as my forefathers planted them for me, so I plant for my children. This sentiment is very familiar to me. Sorry. I need to drink some water. As someone who's planted many trees and then observed how slowly they grow. But I think, again, we're seeing the act of planting trees is sort of being used as a metaphor for the broader idea of caring for the earth and as caring for providing for future generations. And so again, the lesson is that planting trees is an important part of that. It's something that we have to do now to kind of prepare a hospitable world for the future. So with that, I'm going to move from an area where I feel I'm on kind of shaky ground to one where I feel I'm on firmer ground, which is science and the environment. So this is a tree. It's a photo I took in an area outside Lexington. And I think it sort of, I like it because it illustrates, kind of very visually why we might see similarities between trees and people. Trees, and especially trees that grow in fields, like that passage from Deuteronomy suggested, can often grow in this sort of outward way where they create big outward branching limbs. And, we can see a similarity to us with the bilateral symmetry, or I guess, well, anyway, symmetry and a body form that includes a central axis and branching limbs. So it doesn't really strain the imagination to wonder why thinkers and writers for eons have been using trees as metaphors. It's sort of kind of right there. I did want to briefly ask a question and then answer it. What is a tree? Because it's not totally obvious. A tree is not, it's not really a biological category. It's actually more of a category that we invented, and is typically defined as a woody perennial plant that is capable of growing to at least 5 meters or a little more than 15 feet. Trees have, the kind of idea of treeness has evolved numerous times. We see it in different families of plants that aren't closely related to each other. For example, there are trees in the legume family, which also includes crop plants like beans. And then there's the more familiar tree families like the oaks and oak beech family, the apple family, and so on. So that's a little primer. I've sort of started thinking of a tree as sort of a strategy for making a living in the world. Every species needs a strategy, and there are many different ones that have been successful, but certainly the tree is one of those. There's about 60,000 known species of trees. And that's only a small fraction of all the species out there, possibly less than 1%, probably less than 1%. But in some ways, if you look at it in other ways, one might argue that it's the most successful strategy that the world has ever seen for making a living on Earth. So I'll expand on that a bit later. I want to, and I just included these two photos because I think they, to me, they just really, you almost can't look at them and not make and not see sort of a personification of a tree. This one on the left, which I took from our canoe, looks to me like a man standing there saying, "Stop, don't go here." And this one on the right, which is the tulip poplar in Shenandoah National Park. I can't look at it and not see a dancing woman. So again, the idea that visually trees just really suggest themselves as metaphorical. Now we're back to that area, Griffith Wood outside Lexington. So the most obvious way, I think, in which, from a more scientific point of view, we are like trees is that trees are living beings like us. And it sounds like an obvious statement, but I think we all kind of recognize it literally, but I don't know that we always take it seriously, because trees don't have a lot of the signifying features that we might look for when we're trying to recognize life, such as motion or faces that express emotion. So trees can often look static. There is actually a lot going on in this tree, but it goes on underneath the surface of the tree and also underneath the ground, and we don't have access to that through our normal senses. We need to use the instruments of science to really gain access to that activity in trees. But if you think about the sort of definition of life as something that processes energy and resources and metabolizes, reproduces, and is organized in a way that staves off entropy, I think we can certainly agree that trees meet all those criteria. Trees have DNA, they have all the cellular machinery that we do. And not only that, but because we do share a common ancestor, we actually share quite a few genes. I read online that humans and plants share several thousand genes, which carry out the same, or code for proteins that provide the same function in trees that they do in us. So we do have to go back quite a ways to find that common ancestor. I didn't find a definitive answer as much as I would like, but I found a suggestion that we might have to go back about 1.5 billion years ago, probably to some single-celled organism that didn't know that it was fulfilling this role as most recent common ancestor of plants and animals. But it was there, and so we can recognize that all the trees of the world are our distant cousins. And so I encourage you to think about that tomorrow when you're looking at the trees in your neighborhood. So I'm going to go to another slide, looks radically different. This is a extremely zoomed in microscope image of a cell, and that cell is called a stomata, or a stoma. Stomata is plural. All plants have these, and this is actually, I should admit, a tomato, an image of a tomato stoma, but trees have them too. And the point I want to make here is that it looks like a mouth, and it is in a sense a mouth, and the word stoma actually derives from the Greek word for mouth. And trees, so this is another way that trees are like us. They have structures that take in gases from the environment and exhale gases to the environment. And as probably most people know, the primary gas that comes in is carbon dioxide, and the gases that go out are water vapor and oxygen. We obviously inhale oxygen and exhale carbon dioxide, so there's sort of a symmetry there. One key difference here is that we have one mouth per human, but trees can have many. And in fact, I read a suggestion that, and I did a little bit of math and estimated that one full-size deciduous adult tree could have perhaps 1 trillion stomata. So every one of those is sucking up carbon dioxide. So you can look at trees maybe once they leaf out again and think about that, 1 trillion of these tiny cells. The other thing is that, I talked about trees not being static, and this actually illustrates that, because trees don't have a fixed number of stomata. They can produce them as needed, and they can close them and open them as needed. So if a tree finds itself in a drought, it can close its stomata, and that prevents water from escaping. Of course, there's a cost, because then the tree can't take in carbon dioxide, which is its food source. So similar to us, trees are sensing their environment, and they are kind of doing their best to, with the information that they gather from their environment, make decisions, so to speak. I don't want to make it sound like they have the same kind of cognition that we do, but basically doing their best to make a living in the environment they find themselves in. All right, so now I'm zooming way, way out from the microscopic to the macroscopic. This is obviously the Earth. And what we see here is an image that's been produced by from satellite data that basically shows where trees are. And the greener a part of the globe is, the more kind of tree there is, or the more tree canopy there is. So we see kind of the densest green in the tropics, the Amazon rainforest, the Central African rainforest, and Southeast Asia, but there's also green in many other places, all the way up into the high latitude boreal forest, and of course, the temperate forest where we live. About 31% of the globe is currently covered in trees. And this, I use this to illustrate another sort of similarity between us and trees, is that these are two extremely successful ways of making a living on this planet. Obviously, as a species, we've been very successful. Trees as a collective have also been very successful. They've colonized just about everywhere that isn't too cold or too dry. Now, this is a modern image, so it also reflects human activity. And I think we can see some places where trees probably would live, like the Corn Belt and parts of Europe, but they don't, because, or at least not in high density, because we're using those spaces for other things, primarily agriculture. So if, let's say, some alien had visited Earth 1 million years ago and taken a photo from space, it probably would have looked even greener than this. Is there anything else I wanted to say about that? I've read, I think, estimates that humans have reduced the sort of total amount of tree mass on the planet by about half. I take that with a bit of grain of salt, because nobody was there back in the day to measure tree biomass, but I think maybe if we kind of use that as a ballpark figure, it may be reasonably good. And that kind of leads me to my next slide. So I read a lot of scientific papers for my work, and some of them are interesting, some of them are a bit dry. And once in a while you see, I read one that just gets me really excited and makes me say, wow. And this is one from 2018 from a few Israeli scientists. And what they did is they tried to kind of sum up all the biomass on Earth and then assign it to the different types of organisms. And it's one of those kind of like big picture studies that maybe no one else ever thought to do before. So what you see in that left-hand square is that basically it's a plants rule, bacteria are second, and everything else is like just a little, out on the margins. And I actually wrote to the scientists and I said, because I thought it would be cool if I could say that there's more tree biomass than everything else put together, but it wasn't totally obvious from this image. And they confirmed to me that yes, of that green plant area, it's mostly trees. So I just want to point out that animals are just this tiny little purple corner, and then that gets blown up to its own square. And then humans only get that little corner in the bottom right of figure B. And so basically, we tend to be very anthropocentric. We mostly think about ourselves. But this figure to me suggests that that's a mistake. We're really not where the action is on this planet. We are a little corner of the action, and it's mostly a tree's world. So I'd just like to encourage everyone to think about that. All right, so we've discussed some ways that some things we share with trees, huge success in living on this planet, an ability to kind of take in and exhale resources, and sort of a basic body shape. Now I want to think about some ways in which we're quite different from trees. So this is a photo I took, a location that will be familiar to many Kentuckians, Red River Gorge. This is a tree that has decided, or not decided, its seed happened to land on, looks like the edge of an arch, one of those sandstone arches. I think this is Gray's Arch, and it had no choice but to live there. So it germinated, and then it sent down roots and maybe parts of its stem into the rock, or maybe into the very thin soil that had formed on the rock. Somehow or another, it found a way to make a living. And I think this is something we can all agree that we would not be able to do very well. We're not rooted, we move around on the surface of Earth, and if we want to tap into the resources in the soil, we have to do so sort of indirectly via plants or technology. So I think I really see this as a fundamental difference between trees and us. Trees have access to the incredible wealth of resources below ground, which includes kind of microbial resources, fungi, and also nutrients and water. Tree roots have been found to extend more than 20 feet beneath the surface, often to tap very deep sources of water that really can get trees through droughts. So we often may feel sorry for trees during drought, and some shallow-rooted trees may have trouble during drought, but some deep-rooted ones are really almost impervious to drought. See if there's anything else I wanted to say about that. And apparently on average, about 15 to 20% of a tree's mass may be in the below ground roots. One of the great thinkers about trees had a nice quote about that, John Muir. It has been said that trees are imperfect men, now we would say people, and seem to bemoan their imprisonment rooted in the ground. But they never seemed so to me. I never saw a discontented tree. They grip the ground as though they liked it, and though fast-rooted, they travel about as far as we do. The rest of the quote gets a little whimsical for my taste, but I think we see the point, that he he's sort of trying to think like a tree and recognize that rootedness is not necessarily imprisonment. It's not a negative thing. It's actually a positive thing. It really is fundamental to the way trees make a living. So another kind of quality of trees that's pretty obvious is that they can get really, really big. This is me, and it's in front of what I believe to be the world's tallest tree, which is a redwood in California, in Redwood National Park. I say I believe to be because the Park Service doesn't like to tell people where this tree is. So we had to do our own research on the internet, using a couple of guides that had been written, and basically look around until we found a tree that looked like the tree in the photo. So I hope this is the world's tallest tree. Let's put it that way. At any rate, it's a very tall tree, and I think we can see, well, I should say, trees are by far the tallest beings on Earth, and also by far the oldest beings on Earth. And I think it's worth thinking about why that is, especially because it may be kind of surprising. Trees, as we noted, are stuck in place. They seem like they might be kind of vulnerable and not necessarily have a lot of resources or ways to escape danger. So why is it that trees are able to get so big and so old, and most other things around us, including us, don't? Well, I think there's several reasons, and one of them is sort of obvious from this photo, is this thick protective bark. Coast redwoods, as well as many other trees, are adapted to fire. Before I guess Europeans arrived, fire might have swept through this ecosystem regularly, but it wouldn't phase a tree, a huge tree like this. It might take out the small understory trees, clear out the brush, and create really nice growing conditions for the old growth redwoods. Another thing that's less obvious is that trees devote a lot of energy to manufacturing defensive chemicals. Trees are, just like us, constantly under assault from pathogens, insects, and what have you. They can't be vaccinated. They can't hide in their houses, wear masks or not, etc. But they certainly can. They certainly have a kind of immune system, and I think we generally don't recognize how sophisticated this immune system is. When a tree was first sequenced, a poplar tree, it turned out to have roughly 45,000 genes. We have about half of that. So trees are, one might presume, producing about twice as many different kinds of proteins. And we have no idea what most of those do, but we are aware that many of them contribute to tree defense. So I think it's just worth recognizing that trees are extremely sophisticated chemical factories in ways that maybe outstrip what we've managed to do. And most likely we will discover some of these chemicals in the future and find uses for them, perhaps in medicine. A second thing is that trees don't have a genetic program that tells them to stop growing. We all kind of reach a certain height and stop, and then as we get older, we might even shrink a bit. But a tree puts on new wood every year. And the older a tree gets, all else being equal, it will put on more wood than the previous year. So in a way, trees get better and better at being trees as they age. And that goes kind of hand in hand with the fact that trees can live an extremely long time. This tree might be 2,000 years old. It's kind of hard to tell, but certainly redwoods have been found to be that old. And trees are able to do this because they don't get the kind of old age diseases we get, like cancer and heart disease. We gain a lot from being mobile, but all that kind of muscle activity requires a lot of burning of sugars, and that creates oxidative stress, which stresses our tissues and our DNA. And contributes a lot to the fact that we generally can only expect to live maybe 80, 90, 100 years if we're lucky. So trees escape all that, and as a result, they can reach extremely old ages. And I just want to point out that we think of a lot of the oldest trees as being in the West, certainly the redwoods and the giant sequoias, the record-breaking bristlecone pines of Eastern California and Western Nevada. But recently a bald cypress tree was found in a swamp in North Carolina that was older than 2,600 years. So even in the East Coast, which is pummeled by really powerful storms on a regular basis, a tree in the right environment, if it's not disturbed by people, can live an extremely long time. And I find that very profound and kind of moving. Things don't always go so well for trees, though. On the left, we have a very short, shrubby American chestnut tree, and on the right, a white ash tree. And some people are probably aware that these trees are both in trouble. The chestnut has been attacked by a blight fungus for about 100 years, a little more. Ash trees more recently have been attacked by an insect, and both of these the pests are capable of sort of not exactly killing the tree, but girdling the tree, which kills everything above the tree, above the ring that the pest makes. But the difference, the key thing about trees is that they don't die. The roots stay alive, and then they can send up new trunks, and maybe the fungus kills that trunk, and then the chestnut sends up another trunk. And we're seeing the same with the ash tree. You can sort of see some decayed bark, but the ash is already sending up new shoots, and quite possibly this tree will continue to live in a much reduced form. I think of this as being analogous to if, God forbid, one of us were cut off at the ankles and our feet just sprouted new legs and kept going. It's obviously impossible, but this is a kind of a fundamental way in which trees are different from us. They have this ability to just kind of start over, to lose the vast majority of their body mass and keep going. And especially because we are seeing these pests, these diseases and insects that wipe out some of our most valuable trees. I think the fact that trees have this regeneration ability is something we should be really thankful for. It gives hope for the future of these species. I think I thought this was another really nice illustration of the same point. This is a giant sequoia tree that I photographed in California. And you can see that it's been hollowed out by a fire, and yet it still has a nice green, healthy looking canopy. The tree has been able to withstand the loss of a huge amount of its mass because the living part of the tree, which is sort of the edge of the tree, or the part near the edge, that's where the cambium and the xylem and phloem are, where the nutrients and water move up and sugars move down. That's still intact, and as a result, this tree has stayed alive. I'm just gonna check the time. I don't want to go on too long. Okay. And last, I wanted to show these photos from Olympic National Park. These are actually trees that have fallen, but they look vibrant and alive. And these are called, this tree on the left is known as a nurse log. I think it was a Douglas fir. It's got about, I don't know, 1,000 little hemlocks growing from it. And the ecology professor that I took a course with had a nice quote. He said to me, "A tree has half its life as a live tree and then a second life as a rotting log." So again, we tend to think of when a tree falls, that's it, it's done, it's dead, it's sad, it's kind of exhausted itself. But that's not the case at all. It's just starting on another life that's just as important and significant as the life it had as when it was standing. I mean, that's assuming it's allowed to do that, to remain in the forest, and isn't chopped up into mulch, which or something like that. So I kind of want to argue that we want to individualize trees, make them like us. We see ourselves as individuals, and we want to see trees that way. I don't really. The more I learn about trees, the less I see trees as individuals. I see them as maybe an organizational, a way for matter to be organized and for resources to flow. But the idea of each of those little hemlocks that's growing on that Douglas fir as being an individual strikes me as just not really true to the real life of a tree. I'm continuing to develop this idea, so I welcome any thoughts on it. Lastly, I want to show this photo I took, in Mexico, which really illustrates to me the fact that trees are, they form communities. Of course, we can do that too, but trees generally exist in living communities, and especially in the tropics, these are extremely complex, diverse communities. There are probably many dozens, if not hundreds, of species represented in this photo. And when I think about the way we live, we have kind of in our modern lives, rather than welcome diverse living communities into our homes, we sort of exclude them. Most of us live with family members, maybe a few pets. We certainly don't want rodents or insects in our homes, generally speaking. And this is really very different from the way trees live. There are estimates that about 80% of all species that live on land live in forests. And while it's hard to say if that 80% is really accurate, because most of the species on Earth still haven't been identified, but suffice it to say that trees really kind of provide a foundation for much of life on Earth. And I think this is something that we, in our modern lives at least, we really don't do. Even in our gardens, we tend to create really, simplified ecosystems that don't come close to capturing the full complexity of what we see in nature. So I want to spend the rest of the talk kind of, now that I've developed these ways that trees are like us and that not like us, what can we sort of learn from that? How can we apply some of these ideas to some of our material problems, and then maybe some of our spiritual quests as well? So one, a big thing that's on everybody's mind these days is climate change. Maybe you got a hint of this when I was talking about the tree stomata. So trees are intimately in contact with our atmosphere and can have a profound effect on the climate. This is a photo, I think it's from Russia. What we see here is taken from the top of a really tall tower, not by me, unfortunately. That would be cool. And this tower is measuring the gases that are coming out of these trees and the gases that are going into these trees, and trying to get an understanding of how the trees are influencing the atmosphere. So if a mature tree has 1 trillion stomata, there are about 3 trillion trees on the planet. That's a lot of stomata. That's a lot of potential to suck up carbon dioxide and turn it into leaves and roots, and most of all wood, which is a really kind of fairly long-term durable form of carbon. And this has actually happened in the past. A lot of what we call fossil fuels were once forests that ended up in swamps where there wasn't oxygen for the carbon to decay, and then they ended up turning into coal deposits, and in the process drawing down the levels of carbon dioxide from thousands of parts per million in the deep prehistoric times to a few hundred parts per million that we know today. And we're getting alarmed that we're at about 415, 420 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Imagine what it would be like if it was 7,000, as scientists think it might have been once. It would have been a real sauna. So we should be really very grateful for trees. More recently, when Europeans arrived in the Americas, they set off this wave of epidemic diseases that almost depopulated the continent. And some scientists believe that when trees rebounded from the loss of people in the Americas, they drew down enough carbon to cause the Little Ice Age, which caused quite a bit of misery in Europe, ironically. So that's another example of the kind of influence that trees can have and on a large scale on the climate. Now, today, there's a lot of excitement about the idea of using trees to draw down carbon dioxide, either kind of natural forests that already exist or allowing forests to regenerate or planting trees. I actually spend quite a bit of my time writing about this topic. And, you know, I feel like the jury's still out on this whole idea. When I showed that earlier map of the global tree cover, one of the points I made is that the more people that there are on Earth, the fewer trees. That's been the trend historically. Some people feel that if we're smart, if we act intelligently as a global community, we can reverse that. I certainly think that's possible, but I think the point has yet to be proven. We really need to get better at managing land and resources collectively than we have been so far. So I think that'll be something interesting to keep an eye on. Next slide. I want to talk about biodiversity. I think biodiversity kind of gets lost sometimes when there's so much focus on climate change these days. But when I talk to environmental scientists, I find that they themselves express as much concern about biodiversity loss as climate change. And of course, the two are related. This is a white oak tree in my neighborhood. The reason I show it is that there have been studies done, especially by a scientist named Doug Tallamy at University of Delaware, that white oak trees support more species of caterpillar than any other tree in our part of the world, more than 500 species. Most of us don't know these species. They're not necessarily charismatic butterflies like the monarch, but they're all important. They feed birds, they feed other organisms. And so this tree is the foundation of a web of life that's more complex than we know. And that's and I want to go back to that Torah passage that I started with, that drew the distinction between food producing trees and other trees. Well, I would argue that all trees produce food. It may not be food that we eat, but it's food for something and someone. And if we care about life on Earth, then we really need to see all trees as food producing. So I would have to argue with the author of Deuteronomy on that one, or I would like to argue with them. This is another example of that. These logs are feeding fungi in the forest in West Virginia that I visited this summer. So same point, trees are food. Trees are also food for us. So I found this really nice passage in Genesis. I give you every seed-bearing plant and every tree that has seed-bearing fruit, for they shall be yours for food. So this idea of trees being food for us is obviously ancient. What I'm showing here is what we call a food forest that some neighbors and I planted this past spring in our neighborhood. Now, I'm certainly not claiming that we were inspired by Genesis, but I think the idea has resonance across the generations. And the idea is to turn a park that barely had anything going on into a source of food. Obviously, these plants, these trees and shrubs are very small. It will take them a while to grow. but I certainly hope that, similar to that guy planting the carob tree, that in 70 years, somebody might eat from them and have no idea about any of us who planted them. And the broader point I want to make here is that we're surrounded by trees, we're surrounded by food that comes from these trees, and we really have almost lost sight of this. We hardly recognize it at all. That was really driven home to me this fall when my partner and I went on a very short walk in our neighborhood and came across this tree. This is a persimmon tree. It's absolutely loaded with fruit, and I had never noticed it before, despite it being maybe 10-minute, very leisurely walk from my house. And as soon as we saw it, I knew that we were going to be eating those persimmons, and we returned twice a week, I would say, for maybe a month to month and a half. Definitely got a few funny looks from neighbors, but we gathered a whole lot of persimmons and really kept us eating well throughout the fall. Actually, we still have some in our freezer. So this isn't a tree that anybody is tending. Nobody's fertilizing it. It's just growing there, and we're surrounded by these things. And the last illustration I have of that is that this is my friend Lincoln Smith. He's the premier food forester of the DC region. And I went out with him, and then one morning we collected 3 buckets full of acorns from just next to a parking lot in the suburbs here, nothing special. And these are acorns that probably the businesses that in this parking lot just think are annoying because their customers have to drive on them. But Lincoln saw things in a different way. He saw food. In fact, he's told me that of calculations that acorns can provide as many calories per acre as a field of wheat. And these would be much higher quality, protein-rich, fat-rich calories, and obviously would be grown in a much more sustainable way too, which providing much more habitat for other organisms. So I think this photo is just kind of an illustration of how much we're overlooking by not paying attention to the trees around us. So I wanted to close. I'm now extending a bit outside my comfort zone again. I was thinking the other day about what sort of spiritual guidance we might gain from trees. So at the risk of being a bit cheesy, I had a few thoughts. One is that rootedness is resilience. Again, we're back in Red River Gorge here, and this tree has clinging onto that rock for its life. And in our modern society, many of us have become kind of very, very mobile, almost rootless. We move around often. We did, at least before coronavirus. I think the pandemic has given many of us an opportunity to examine that and maybe recognize that staying in one place has its benefits too. And I really trees in this past year have really been an inspiration for me in kind of making sense of this new world that we live in. Trees don't have a choice about where to live. Well, somebody is making some weird drawings on my screen here. This is literally right outside my house. That's my curb. This is the street, and that's a little sycamore tree. The seed landed there. It had no choice, and it's decided to try to make a living with what it had available to it, which is not much. We have gotten I think many of us in the habit of having the whole world's resources available to us. We can order just about anything with the click of a button. But we're also recognizing that that's really not sustainable, and that we may need to start thinking more about using what's around us, looking for local supply chains, maybe not buying everything that our hearts desire, but thinking more about what we need rather than what we want. So this little sycamore illustrates that idea to me. Be a community builder. This is a bald cypress tree. I saw in the Pocomoke River in Maryland. And I like this photo because it's not just a tree, it's like a whole island. Some soil has gathered at the base of the tree. Other species are growing there. There's a bird up in the canopy. And this tree is providing not just for itself, but for a whole living community. You know, many of us, I think, are also community builders, but I think we can certainly get inspiration from trees. And lastly, just don't forget that sense of wonder. I mean, it just strikes me that we live among these enormous, magnificent beings, and we kind of tend to just overlook them, even though they're by far the largest organisms in our environment. So one of the few benefits of the pandemic, I would say, has been really giving me, and I think many people, an opportunity to slow down and really recognize the trees around us. Obviously not this coast redwood for me, but all of us, I think, have access to wonderful trees in our environment. So I hope that was coherent and interesting. And if we have any time left, I'm happy to hear others' thoughts or answer questions.
If you all want to join me in another round of applause for our speaker, and I'll retrieve some questions in the chat while you all think about whether or not you want to use the raise hand function. I'll begin with the chat and reserve a question for myself, but let me start with what's here. You said something interesting with regard to the Bible verse about planting a tree, and even if the Messiah comes. You said this implies that the material world still matters and that we still need to care for it. For you personally, do trees have meaning, value, a role to play in the spiritual world?
Ooh. Well, there's a question I hadn't prepared an answer for. You know, I don't feel like I have very well-formed thoughts about spiritual matters. I think the answer is yes, absolutely. I mean, I think the fact that we see trees in, I think, pretty much all of the major world religions. For example, the well-known story that the Buddha is said to have found enlightenment under a tree. I think that, to me, is maybe the best evidence that, yes, trees definitely have a role to play in our spiritual lives. But since I spend my 9 to 5s thinking about science and this kind of other mode of thinking, I'm afraid I haven't developed my own ideas, thoughts on this topic. In fact, I'm sure there are people in the audience who could probably give a more profound answer. So I'm going to have to leave it at that.
We got them on there, didn't we?
All right. If folks could please remember to mute yourselves, because some of you are sharing whether or not you intend to. Another question from the chat, Gabriel. Do you think if the president of Brazil and other officials who are responsible for logging in the Amazon basin could be shown the slide showing the green places on Earth and explain what is happening in the world as a result of these practices, they would take the problem more seriously?
Yeah, I'm afraid the answer is probably not. I mean, actually, Brazil has been a real leader in developing the ability to observe forests from space. I think that kind of gets lost a bit, but a few decades ago, it was recognized that Amazon deforestation was a huge problem, and to their great credit, Brazil took it seriously. They have their own space agency. I'm not sure if they launched their own satellites or partner with other countries for that, but at any rate, they've become very sophisticated at analyzing and using imagery from space, as well as other ways of studying and observing their own forests. So, and they really cut the deforestation rate dramatically, and they were actually a world leader for a while. Obviously, the current president, Jair Bolsonaro, is not interested in that information. He's actually, or his government has suppressed Brazil's own environmental and space agencies when they were just trying to report, fact-based, science-based information about deforestation rates. I don't follow Brazilian politics too closely. I think that some of the international pressure has helped a bit, but no, I don't think that simply providing information is going to change the politics there. I think international pressure is key. I think I don't think we in the U.S. have a lot of clout because we don't actually import a lot from Brazil. I think Europe and China import a lot more, and the pressure from those places would probably be very helpful. Yeah, but this isn't just a matter of a lack of information.
Gabriel, it's been, first of all, a two-part question. First of all, part one, how sympathetic are you to the hypothesis that the diminution of biodiversity and cutting down trees is a contributing factor to the global pandemic and to ones we've had before it, but most notably COVID-19? And part two of my question is, presuming that the answer to the first question is yes, what should we be focused on tree-wise coming out of pandemic?
I know there's been quite a bit written about this. My understanding is that the current pandemic is thought to have originated in a bat species, and I'm not sure if there's a direct connection between deforestation and the sort of emergence of this particular virus from a bat cave in one part of China to Wuhan, where it seems to have become a human, it seems to have spilled over to humans. I think, it seems like the wildlife trade may be implicated. And in general, I mean, there's many good reasons to stop deforestation. And I think that it's certainly a popular argument that preventing pandemics is one of them. And I think there may be something to that, but I would just point out that agriculture is another huge area where diseases, pathogens can spill over from animals to people. And I don't think deforestation is the only driver of pandemic disease, that's for sure. So it's certainly an oversimplistic answer. It may be a partial answer.
And part two, what can be done coming out of pandemic?
I mean, again, like I would say, we need to stop, as a global community, like get a handle on deforestation. But it's not simple. I mean, I don't think anybody wakes up in the morning and says, "Oh, I can't wait to go deforest." Deforestation happens for all kinds of reasons. It's largely economically driven. It often happens in places where people are really struggling to make a living, and we need to, meet the needs of people. You can't just, and actually the president of Brazil has said this. I mean, in different ways. Like, who are we to lecture Brazil or other developing countries? We've cut down almost all our forests. And now that we're rich and we don't need to do that anymore, it sort of sounds a little hypocritical to say, well, you shouldn't do that unless we're gonna, help these countries, find other paths to prosperity. And that's just admit, I don't have the answers on that. That's a really complex problem.
So getting back to your working title, are trees human? How are they like us? How are they different from us? And what can we learn from each other? A participant has posted do trees communicate with each other? And if so, by what mechanism?
Yeah, that's a really hot topic. I'm sure some folks read the recent New York Times Magazine story, or the Over story, or The Hidden Life of Trees. These are two books that have come out in the last few years and kind of really promoted this hypothesis. I think it's pretty clear that trees do communicate, but I think, you know, it's also tempting to extend this metaphor like beyond, certainly what beyond the current science can support. I think, you know, one has to draw a distinction between trees sort of maybe sharing with each other. Like there's a famous study showing that different species of trees can transfer carbon containing compounds from one to the other, underground. That may be communication, but it also may not be communication. It may be something simpler. I think communication implies information transfer, and that's like kind of a higher bar scientifically that to prove that information is being transmitted. You know, I think it's also been shown that trees can emit chemicals. Like maybe if a tree is being attacked, it might emit chemicals into the air that can signal to other trees that there's a threat, and those other trees might upregulate their production of defensive chemicals. Apologize for using some sciencey jargon there, but
Not at all.
Again, it's like this is signaling. Is it actual like intentional communication? I think a lot more science remains to be done on that topic.
Would anyone like to raise their hand or unmute and ask a question the old-fashioned way? Otherwise, I'll wrap up. I'm not seeing any.
Judith's next.
Go ahead, please.
Okay. First of all, Gabriel, I'd like to say thank you for speaking out about Brazil. And the fact is that some of us think, well, you know, it's the president, it's the administration, if they just clamp down on these people. But there are a lot of indigenous people in the Amazon who are dependent on cutting down trees, getting a little land that's tillable, so they on subsistence. And that really is a problem. And I'm glad you referred to that it isn't just telling the government, whoever's in power, they have to crack down on the folks or on, granted, there are some large corporations which are burning down forests so that they can use the land. But a lot of it is due to the fact that there are these indigenous people who are very much dependent on just living. And they are essentially destroying part of the forest, but that's a real problem, and obviously.
Yeah, I think the vast majority of the large scale deforestation that, you know, we might see in satellite images is corporate driven. The indigenous communities have obviously been living in the forest for thousands of years, and like you say, they might do small scale clearing, but they don't have either the means or the incentive to clear thousands of acres and plant soybeans. That's coming from outside pressures.
Thank you.
But you're absolutely right that I think, you know, indigenous rights is extremely important, and you know, if in the future there's a political will to really like rein in deforestation, it needs to be done in a way that also meets the needs of the people living in the forest.
Thank you.
So, Gabriel, inspired by your talk, I want to share a poem. It's in the Reconstructionist prayer book. It's attributed to Shin Shalom, entitled Tu B'Shvat. On Tu B'Shvat, when spring comes, an angel descends, ledger in hand, and records each bud, each twig, each tree, and all our garden flowers from town to town, from village to village. The angel makes a winged way, searching the valleys, inspecting the hills, flying over the desert, and returns to heaven. And when the ledger will be full, of trees and blossoms and shrubs, when the desert is turned into a meadow and all our land is a watered garden, messianic days will be with us. God of rootedness and resilience, help us to cultivate a sense of wonder inspired by our speaker and by our tradition. As our ancestors planted trees for us, so we be mindful to plant them for generations to come. May this be our blessing, and let us say together, Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Yasher Koach and Todah Rabbah to Gabriel. Are there any more questions tonight before we sign off? You can go ahead and unmute yourself at this point, and we can go to the gallery view and just socialize a little bit.
Yeah, on the fish
I want to say hello to my colleague, Rabbi Laura Bellows.
Hello, thank you for having me. This has been wonderful.
Do you all know
Gabriel
each
was terrific. Thank you for joining us.
other? Okay. But all rabbis are fellows. Yeah, well, Laura helped me very much in stumbling a bit less over the
You did not stumble.
philosophical material.
It was great. It was great.
Wow, no tough questions from my parents. That's disappointing.
Well,
Well, it is wonderful to see the payoff. You'll remember when you were a very young boy, we read you a children's book about the cycle of life, about how trees grow and then they fall and they decay and provide food for insects and fungi and so on. And now you're giving us back the same story.
Oh, I completely forgotten that book, but I'm sure it's all in there.
Oh, it's in there somewhere.
Gabriel, you didn't mention the Tule tree in Oaxaca, the whitest tree in the world.
Oh yeah, I've actually seen that tree. I read recently that it's not doing well though.
It doesn't look good. I put a picture in the chat.
Oh, I gotta take a look.
You're right.
You know, I see Leon Raven has
Yeah.
been sitting there for quite a while wanting to ask a question. Let's give him a chance.
yes, yeah. Now I can see him raising a hand in the gallery mode. Nobody was doing it via the Zoom tool. Leon, please.
Yeah, I just you mentioned that trees have multiple lives, which I found very interesting. Even after they die, they either continue living in some form or create sort of help life in other forms. So on the other hand, we in our very civilized society, civilized in quotations, tend to cut down trees. Of course, partly to use their resource, but partly for many other reasons. Should we not be cutting down trees? How do you feel about it?
Well, I think we're always going to want to use some lumber. It's an excellent material, as anyone who lives in a house probably appreciates. So no, I wouldn't say we shouldn't cut down trees. And there are actually people who, like friends in the environmental world, who maybe think that we should be cutting down more trees. And by that I mean not just obviously not cutting down trees just to cut down trees, but because in some ways wood may be a lower carbon material than steel or concrete, which produce a huge amount of CO2 emissions in their production. And this would be coupled with kind of improved forest management. So there are people who argue that you could actually have more standing timber at the same time that you have more timber being produced from a particular piece of land if you use very modern science-based forestry. I don't know, I'm not enough of an expert to really say that one way or the other. I definitely think that much of our timber production today comes out of these plantations of very fast-growing trees, like a lot of the Southeast has become one big pine plantation. That's obviously not supporting a lot of biodiversity. And I recently learned that the trees grow so fast that the timber, the wood is quite weak compared to the older growth trees that were used. So my house, the joists in the floor are better than the joists being produced today, and actually building codes have had to be revised to require thicker joists. So we're getting these really fast growing trees, but then we need more of them to create the same function. It seems like we're not actually gaining anything. So anyway, that's a long-winded way to say we definitely should not be cutting down old growth. I think everyone can agree on that. And I think we could definitely improve the way we're managing our non-old growth forests. And we are definitely going to continue to have timber production for the foreseeable future.
Do you want to say something about the necessity of invasive?
Anything else?
I have a quick question.
Yes.
I read recently that or a friend sent me one of those little, like pop statistic images that said that human biomass, that what we've created has now surpassed, or sorry, the human non-biological mass that we've made has now surpassed the biomass on the planet.
That was by the same researchers that wrote that other paper that I shared.
Got it. So I guess I wanted to hear, first of all, whether you had heard that statistic and any reflections on that. And second of all, whether you think there's, any ideas you might have for as we continue to build and design our cities and grow them more, things that we can be doing to be kinder to the biomass in the city.
Yeah, well, I saw that paper and I found it quite kind of profound and also somewhat disturbing. The result was that the total of kind of stuff, human-made stuff, either already outweighs or is about to outweigh like all the living stuff on Earth. And just the fact that we're just one species and we're so bad at meeting our needs efficiently that we feel like we need to fill the world with all this stuff just for us. Like, it doesn't really do anything for any of the other millions of species. I mean, I think that's a real statement about our kind of selfishness and wastefulness. I mean, I feel like anybody would agree that we could be living much more efficiently than we do. But the question is how to kind of generate the will to do that at a societal level. It's really more of a social science question than any sort of natural science question, I think. And yeah, I don't know. I may be interested in your thoughts on that, actually. I guess the other thing I would say is that it's kind of obvious, but we need to stop like producing things that are used for once and then go in a landfill. Like this idea of a circular economy has been around a long time. I mean, I think we need to like really make that a reality much more than we have been. But I'm interested in other people's ideas. Yeah, tough question. You're muted.
Lou, are you raising a hand? Lou Shane,
You're on
are you
mute, I
raising a
think.
hand?
Unmuted now? Yeah, I'd just like to clarify a point as a forest pathologist. Trees do die. They do resprout, and the sprouts sometimes, and they resprout. But once the root system dies, the tree is gone. It's not a perpetual type life. I think you may have implied that you could mean that.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. If trees never died, the world would be totally covered in very old, ancient trees. I mean, do you know like how many resprouts a chestnut could be expected to go through before it gives up the ghost?
Well, I worked on chestnut and chestnut plate, and yeah, I've seen trees die. I've worked on the sprouts, and eventually the whole sprout dies. So it can go on for some time. There's still many sprouts, American chestnuts still out there in the woods. But advances are being made in trying to restore chestnut. Several different mechanisms, but that's a whole new story. I won't get into that now.
Well, I heard at one talk I attended, a speaker from the Chestnut Foundation estimated there were something like 300 to 400 million chestnuts still out there. And for a tree that we think of as having been wiped out, the fact that there's still potentially hundreds of millions out there I found that pretty impressive and somewhat optimistic. Although, of course, none of them are the grand old chestnut trees that would have lived 100 years ago.
Yeah, well, a lot of those trees are very small, and they get reinfected by the fungus, and they die too. But there's still a lot of biomass of chestnut in the forest.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments for our speaker? All right. Well, once again, Toda Rabah and Yashar Koach, Gabriel, for a terrific and enlightening presentation. And once again, thank you to all of our sponsors, Ohave Zion, the Lexington Havurah, Hadassah, Jewish Federation of the Bluegrass, and Hillel at UK. Let's do this again sometime. And please keep a lookout online for other Tu B'Shvat related events, both in our community and all over the country.
All right. Well, thank you very much, David, and great to see lots of old friends, newer friends on here.
You are most welcome. And Lou, we have to have you present sometime too now. Lou's already leading our birding course, but now we got to get him to talk to us about the trees. I suppose I suppose they go hand in hand, or maybe wing and wing, or whatever the metaphor is. Good night, all. Laila Tov.
Thank you.
Night.
Excellent talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabe.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Great work. Great work, Gabriel.
Inspiring
really
for spring.
You left.
Well, I hope you're pleased. We had over 77 distinct participants. Some people were attending as couples, and then we had the Townsends were a party of 3. So you would probably at one point hit the 85 mark.
No, that's great. I think people are obviously stuck at home, and it's a great time to be giving a talk, I guess. A lot of people looking for something to do. So, well, I appreciate your organizing it.
You're most welcome. If you get the opportunity to edit the recording, will you send it back to me without the opening conversation before we let people in at 7 o'clock, and perhaps editing some of this chat now, but I'd love to see it.
You're recording, right?
I recorded, but I thought you were recording as well.
I turned it off and I forgot to turn it on again. So we're going to have to rely on your recording. But if you want to send it to me, I'm happy to do it.
Yes, I'm still recording.
Okay, good. Whew.
All right.
Yeah, completely slipped my mind.
Okay. Good night, everybody.
All right. Good night. Thank you.